Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the panel for your presence today. All of us in a position of policymaking are searching for the best relevant data to use to make the policies, and we're all interested in a better, cleaner environment, whether it's the water, the air, or the climate in general. My questions go to Ms. Arroyo. In your written testimony, they make the claim the fourth National Climate Assessment's findings, along with those in 2018 Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC report, are clear and should be a call to immediate action. While the claims are very clear stated in these reports, the underlying data, to me, is a bit murkier, and I want to explore that a little bit. These claims are based on the theory that global average surface temperature, or GAST, has increased with greenhouse gas emissions. Validating this theory requires both a valid global average surface temperature record and the use of the proper mathematical methods typically called structural analysis. I think you would agree with that. My concern is whether either of these necessary conditions has been met. An August 1981 article in the journal Science, authored by Dr. James Hensel et al., calls into question both of these points. And, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit the article for the record.
Without objection.
In this article, Hansen et al. States problems in obtaining a global temperature history are due to the uneven station distribution within the southern hemisphere and ocean areas poorly represented in the smaller number of stations for earlier times. They go on to state the time history of warming obviously does not follow the course of the CO2 increase, indicating that other factors must affect global mean temperature. In other words, the correlation was not present. The fact is that over the period of 1900 to date, the year 1900 to date, for very significant portions of the globe, there was really no surface temperature data at all, and yet in 2019, we have a global average surface temperature record going back to the 1880s. It seems obvious that the IPCC and NCA4 would have to overcome these obstacles in order to provide such clear findings that are viewed to be a call for immediate action. My question particularly and specifically to you is the following. If you were to become convinced that the published official GAST data were not, in fact, reliable, a reliable depiction of the circumstance, would we then have to conclude that the climate models that are now tuned to replicate the fabricated global average surface temperature pattern are not able to provide reliable projections of the future state of the climate?
So, Congressman, I've worked on climate change for 20 years exclusively, and my first introduction to climate change was 30 years ago when I was representing Governor Buddy Roemer on a task force of the National Governors Association that on a bipartisan basis already thought that the science was compelling enough to issue a report that said that both states and the federal government should be addressing this. The impacts have only become more severe and more obvious based on what we're seeing in terms of these extreme events. CO2 levels are rising. That is documented. We've been having measurements in Mauna Loa for many years, but of course we have the ice core record and other records that go back millennia. We know that we are at CO2 levels that have never been experienced since millions of years ago, and that's going to lead to dramatic impacts like sea level rise and more intense and frequent storms, et cetera, et cetera. So, you can maybe find a study or a scientist in a certain area that might quibble with that. There were some issues earlier that got reconciled because of the orbit of the devices, the satellites that take the service record.
But I want you to address the gas temperature readings and the lack of information, especially from the southern hemisphere, from the turn of the century to present. What about that?
I'm not familiar with that particular study, but what I am familiar with is the scientific record, which is on a published peer-reviewed basis, overwhelming. That was what the IPCC scientists from all around the world look at. That was what our own federal government scientists used in the National Climate Assessment. This was the fourth such assessment that has been done. And so I think you can cherry pick and find a study that might make an alternative point. But we're living in a world that everybody objectively knows is different from the world that we were born into. And that's because the emissions of climate polluting gases like CO2 that are being pulled out of the earth and put into the atmosphere at an unprecedented rate. And we're seeing changes that are much faster and more severe than we even anticipated 30 years ago when I started looking at this issue. So I mean, I'm happy to take a look at that report, but having worked on this for 30 years on a bipartisan basis, I don't see any
But
reason
you
to
are
doubt
happy to look
the
at the
science.
report.
Happy to look at the report, but I don't see any
And if you find
reason to
indeed
doubt
that the
science.
GAST data is insufficient based on an insufficient number of stations, you would be critical of the GAST findings at that point.
I'd be happy to look at the weight of the evidence, but just like when we're looking at our health, if a doctor says that you have a serious disease and recommends a severe course of action, you might want to look at other experts, and so I would look at it along with the other
Right.
scientific
My time's
reports out there.
expired. I
Thank
thank
you.
Thanks, Jim.